Responding to RFPs and crafting proposals are some of the worst things that salespeople have to do in their jobs, especially when you've played no role in crafting the requirements that you are responding to. But today, I'm going to show you a bunch of techniques to stack the deck in your favor. So whether you're responding to RFPs or just putting out customer proposals, stay tuned for some tactics that are going to help you win more of them. So welcome to another episode of Sales Lab Live. I'm David Premer, and I really like this topic. Now I know RFPs, some salespeople might be looking at me cross-eyed saying, RFPs, I don't do RFPs in my job. And if you are, God bless you, that's great. But a lot of salespeople have to respond to RFPs, requests for proposals, where customers give us their stated list of requirements and say, put together a proposal that meets these things. Now, I want to say up front that not all RFP processes are created equal. So there's kind of two situations that, what I'm going to say now may not be entirely for you. So number one, if you actually get an RFP or you had the potential, the ability to craft the requirements and help kind of structure that RFP on behalf of the customer or whoever was doing it, and you get those requirements and it was bam, this thing was written for you and life is good, well then maybe you don't need to do what I'm going to be doing today. Of course, for most of us, we don't live in that world. The other thing is, if you live in a world where, let's say, you're doing RFPs for the government, it's a very stringent, rigid requirement process where you actually can't get in touch with anyone. They typically go with the lowest bidder, and so the requirements are kind of it doesn't really matter what it is anyways, and it's highly structured, highly choreographed, then you might have difficulty executing some of the tactics we're talking about here. So I'm not saying this is a panacea, this is a universal thing that you can do, everyone's going to be able to do, but I'll tell you, I have had really good success using these tactics as a salesperson, as a sales leader, so I want to lay them on you now. So what are these tactics? What's the process? What is this designed to do? If you get an RFP from a customer saying, hey, here's what our requirements are, here's what we need, and you're looking at this thing and you're saying to yourself, first, this sucks. It looks like it was written by maybe another vendor. Or maybe a lot of the requirements that they're asking for are actually not things that you do on purpose. Because oftentimes what happens is when a customer gives us a list of requirements, these requirements, the things they want to have in their solution and their proposal, are not necessarily forward-thinking things. Oftentimes, these are basically replacements for the thing they have now. So if they have a crappy process or a list of reports they run now, they might come to you and say, yes, here's our list of requirements. This is exactly what we need because it's what we have now. And I've been on the receiving end of tons of those kinds of RFPs. I was in enterprise sales for many years, especially I was a solutions consultant, solution engineer for 8 years. And, a lot of these things were dropped on my desk. Hey, Premer, respond to these things. And I'm oh boy, we don't do half this stuff because it's old school bullshit stuff that no one does anymore, right? So these are the kinds of requirements that I want to help you reframe. And not to unnecessarily get into a little bit of slidage here, but this is the topic of the day. How are we going to win more RFPs? And one of the ways that we're going to do this, one of the things I want to focus on is leveraging what I refer to as the power of prescription. So I might talk a little bit about this in my book, but I've definitely leaned into it a lot more over the last couple of years. I do talk about it in the book because a lot of you have read the section of my book where I talk about how to respond to RFPs and some of these tactics that we've used. But what I want to kind of just lay on you in general is the idea of being prescriptive in your sales cycles is actually quite powerful. And if you're looking for a helpful resource on this, I do have an article that I wrote on my blog, 3 powerful ways to lead your customer through the buying process. I've definitely talked about this post on the Sales Lab channel before. And, it kind of speaks to some of the data that's out there. And I show this actually in my training in the very first session that I run with my clients when I talk about kind of the current state of modern selling. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing now. This idea that the sales teams of the past were the ones that kind of sat back and they were responsive, meaning, we get a list of requirements for the RFP from the customer. And we say, oh, this is great, Mr. and Mrs. Customer. These are your requirements. Let's respond to these. And, the idea of being responsive as well applies to, just sales execution in general. So a customer calls you up and says, hey, David, I'm looking for a solution that does A, B, and C. And I say, okay, great. Here's what we do. Let me know if you have any questions. Look around, look at the reviews online and make the decision for yourself. And that actually ends up being very difficult for customers to do. Think about you going online to like book a vacation, right? And you look at all the requirements that you have, and you look at all the reviews online, and your head's spinning because you're like, I don't know what to pick. There's too much here, right? And so what actually happens is you have much more difficulty buying that product or service. And then when you do, you're like, oh, you know what? I don't know if I bought the right thing. Versus the sales teams of the future. And again, I know I'm going through this rather quickly because this is not the point of this discussion, but rather to kind of really hit home on this idea that the sales teams of the future are the ones that lead their customers through the buying process, right? Like if they make it easy for their customers to buy, they're more prescriptive, they give more advice, they don't sit back and say, let me know if you have any questions. And because we lead them through the process, they actually experience much fewer levels of regret. And this is very relevant to RFP processes because this is actually a document, an image I actually have in my book that I've ripped out and appropriated for this purpose, is that, we think that, we need to intersect our solutions, the problems that we can help solve with our customer's journey. Like these things are going to magically intersect. And the reality is, left to their own devices, customers will just go on the journey on their own and oftentimes be led astray unless we intervene. Unless, from a sales and marketing perspective, we can influence and intervene and direct them towards our solutions. So that's what I want to talk to you about today as it relates to working through the RFP process. And I'll kind of frame this up with some stories. So for example, at my third startup, we were a forward-thinking feedback, coaching, and recognition platform. This is the company that was acquired. I know many of you know that we were acquired by Salesforce, and that's how I got to work there. Now, you can imagine when it comes to like feedback and performance, the kinds of things that companies do to get their people more feedback and coaching and recognition at work historically fell into this bucket of the annual performance review, right? And people hated the review process. It was so time consuming. There was all this like legalities and all of this kind of, ridiculous process around it. People hated it, okay? And so oftentimes we would get requirements in RFP format that we would be forced to respond to. People would be asking us things like, okay, like how do you typically handle, legal situations when people say in their performance review things they shouldn't say? Or like, how do you do like a whole approval process around the performance review? And like, how do you do this around the performance review and that? And we looked at these things and we're like, we don't do this stuff, right? Like, now, do we solve the problem that the customer was looking to solve? 100%. We 100% do that. But we don't solve it in the way that they think about solving the problem. And in fact, like we don't want to kind of stoop down and say, yeah, we're going to do this traditional thing because that's not what we believed. And so oftentimes when you get these set of requirements, hopefully you have the opportunity. And that's why I say this isn't for everyone, because you're not going to always be able to connect with a customer and shape the requirements and get access to them. But certainly in kind of the B2B tech space where things are a little bit less regimented than, let's say, the government space, you do have the ability to have these conversations. And so what we would do is we would go out to the clients, we'd have these conversations and say, hey, you know what? Either in advance, what kind of solution are you looking for? Like, what's the problem you're looking to solve? And people would tell us things like, oh yes, like we're trying to engage our young millennial workforce. They keep asking us for more feedback, coaching, and recognition, and like we want to help them with that. We're like, great, okay? Now, sometimes you have that conversation before you get the RFP. Sometimes it's after, okay? That's okay. So imagine us, we kind of had this conversation with a customer. They kind of lay out their requirements and they say, okay, you know what? There's so many vendors here, like to help us make sense of this thing, we're going to put this process out to RFP. And so we get this RFP and we're looking at the requirements of this RFP and we're saying to ourselves, like, first of all, if we respond to this thing as is, we're going to lose. Okay. So I think you need to be real with yourself around the fact that are you going to be winning or losing this thing based on what's on this piece of paper? And if you're going to lose, if you didn't have a hand in crafting those requirements or you're going to lose, well, then you might as well blow this thing up. Right? Because you're going to lose anyways. So sometimes circumventing the process, reaching out to the customer can still be extremely valuable. So you're going to go out to the customer and and this is what we did. We went to the customer, we said, hey, look, we had this conversation before around, what you were looking to do. And you said you had this large millennial workforce, you want to engage them. They hated the feedback, and coaching process that they did in the annual reviews. And is that still the case? And they said, yes, that's the case. And we said, okay, good. So, but here's the thing. When I look at these requirements that you have in your RFP, it kind of reads like an old school performance review selection process. In fact, I'm sure many of the requirements you have here are because these are the things that you currently run today. And the funny thing was, this particular customer I'm referring to was like an HR outsourcing firm. So this is something they knew a lot about. And this is why they wanted this forward-thinking solution. But when we saw these requirements, we said, these obviously look like things that maybe you're doing today. And again, we don't want to make the customer feel bad about what they're doing. We said, this looks like something that maybe you're doing today. And this is why these requirements read like this. But you told us that you're looking for something like kind of more forward-thinking and progressive. And they said, well, yes, we are. We said, okay, well, here's the problem. If we respond to this set of requirements as is, I don't feel, and I know you're saying you want us to be involved in this process, but I don't feel our chances are going to be that good because, in fact, there are things on your list of requirements that we do not do. And we do not do these things on purpose, right? Because our solution is different. It's modern. It's built for today. And, you can lay that on as thickly as you want. But we don't do these things on purpose. And at the same time, there are things that we do that are fantastic and new and innovative and things that you said you wanted. Or in the case of, let's say we haven't spoken to this customer before. These are things that other clients like you do want that are not on this list of requirements. So if we just fill this out as is, I feel like we're going to lose because we don't do some of these things on purpose. And some of the other things that you actually really need and want aren't even in this list of requirements. So what the customers, and they agreed with us. And so we actually end up having an opportunity to work with the customer to kind of refine their list of requirements. And they actually retracted the RFP and put it out with some of these more progressive things. Now, again, do they know what those progressive things are? Not really. That's our job, right? Back to this idea of being prescriptive, right? And helping, if I go back to the slide, helping their journey intersect with our solution by shaping that journey. So we said basically, hey, look, here's what progressive companies like you do today and the future, and here's how our solution meets those requirements. So we were shaping the customer's journey, and they ended up moderating their requirements based on what we said, and in the end, we ended up winning the deal. Right now, again, that's kind of a story of yes, we were involved in shaping the requirements, but it was based on feedback from the customer and this recognition that sometimes through, I'm not going to say through no fault of their own, but sometimes customers put out these RFPs and these requirements and so on because it's all they know. It's all they know, right? And they need us to help consult with them and help direct them, in the right way. Another situation we happened to be in, again at the same company, where we got a list of requirements that was kind of the same. And, in the end, we went back to the customer and we said, hey, you know what, we actually kind of took a step back and it was a bit of a different situation. We said, hey, look, these requirements I'm sure are fine based on, what it is that you're trying to do today and, where you're kind of coming from. But if it's not aligned with, where we are and where progressive clients like the ones we work with are, and probably kind of where you want to go in the future. And this was a technology company. They were actually a pretty progressive company to begin with. And so we actually said, and I say this in the nicest possible way, we're not going to respond. Because if we do, we're going to lose. And it's actually a big waste of our time to respond because these requirements don't seem to be aligned with what we're going to do. And in fact, we could have taken that approach with the first client as well. Say, hey, look, if you're stuck with this set of requirements, I don't want to invest our time because I'll tell you, I've spent hours over the years, especially earlier in my career, investing in RFP responses, which take a long time. Now, I know, shout out to my friends, there's a lot of technologies out there that can help you respond to RFPs and make them quicker to respond to. Back in the day, we also had, technology that could help do that, but it still takes a long time. It's a big investment. And, our time and resources are precious. We don't want to make that investment. So what do we tell the customer? We are not going to do this, right? But at the same time, your requirements, kind of speak to the fact that you're trying to be more forward-thinking. You as an organization are forward-thinking. And so we think you'd actually be a really great fit for our solution, but not with these requirements as presented. And so in the end, the customer came back and they said, 100%, we agree. And they said, we'll put this RFP out. We're going to keep it as is just to kind of, do a level set and weed some stuff out. But they gave us a buy to basically the final round. So to give you a sense, again, where do we start? To give you a sense, what should you do if you find yourself in an RFP situation? Ask yourself the question, am I winning? Am I losing? Do I have the opportunity to win this? current course and speed with stated requirements? If the answer is no, and you do have the ability to have these conversations, then use the RFP interaction as a bit of like a sales process to be able to go back to the customer and say like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, these requirements do not read like something that aligns with our solution on purpose, and see if you can help shape those requirements. Because at the end of the day, if you start responding to RFPs that are completely out of left field and don't have, items that match up with what you can do, you're going to lose anyways, right? And that's not good for anyone. So I say to you, especially if you're in the technology space, B2B technology, where you can influence these RFPs either before or after, right? And kind of help shape that journey of the customer, either by, influencing the requirements, being very upfront about your willingness to even participate unless kind of the process changes or is molded, then you're going to be in good shape if you have the ability to do that. So, and one final thing, even if you're not in like an official RFP process and a customer says, please, give us, a proposal or list of requirements, and you suspect that you are in competition either with other vendors that are more traditional that kind of do different things, or you're just in competition with the customer's dated, let's call them, expectations of what your kind of solution can do, don't hesitate to be prescriptive, to lead the customer down the path to your solution by helping shape their requirements. So those are my RFP tips for today to help you win more of them. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time in the Sales Lab.